as Chinese forces attempted a new advance into the South Korean city of Kapyong in April of 1951. All that stood in their way was a small brigade of Canadian, Australian, and New Zealander soldiers. Outnumbered 10-1, the UN had to hold the line against a much better armed force. While the Chinese were carrying new Soviet machine guns, the UN soldiers only had single-bolt action rifles from World War II. With US reinforcements weeks away from arriving and a seemingly endless number of Chinese soldiers supporting the North Koreans, the small UN brigade at Kapyong had insurmountable pressure on their shoulders. If the city fell, the front line would be breached, almost assuring the total Chinese invasion of South Korea. The Australian and Canadian forces then set up defensive positions in two hills overlooking the valley and established the few machine gun posts they could manage as they prepared for the incoming attack. They knew an onslaught was coming, as their South Korean allies fled through the valley in disarray after losing a battle in the north. As the sun began to set on the evening of April 23, 1951, the UN soldiers watched in disbelief at the Kapyong Valley below them as an approaching horde of Chinese soldiers was rushed in their position. With their South Korean allies bolting in a panic, it was up to them to stop the Chinese advance and hold the line at whatever cost. An ideological war. After World War II, the world was submerged in a colossal ideological battle. On one side, there were the Western capitalist democracies, and on the other, there were the new communist regimes that seemed to be sprouting worldwide. As the Soviet Union and China attempted to influence smaller nations to assimilate communist philosophies, the US and its Western allies did all they could to halt the advancement of communism. Meanwhile, in the middle of such a dire scenario stood the Korean Peninsula, which was split into two sections after being released from the Japanese Empire in 1945. The North went to the Soviets, who established a communist government, while the South went to the US, which tried to form a democratic government. As the world sank into the conflict that would be known as the Cold War, the stability between the two Koreas treaded on thin ice, as both debuting nations wanted to unite Korea under their own way of government. On June 25, 1950, the North took the first step in a lightning-fast attack that overwhelmed the South, and in just a few months, they practically conquered the whole Korean peninsula. However, with the arrival of the newly formed UN coalition force just in the nick of time, the Republic of South Korea was saved from utter destruction. The UN forces quickly forced the North Koreans to withdraw, and because of US deliberations, they even undertook a massive offensive in a hasty effort to destroy the communist government in the North. The strategy nearly worked, but China stepped into the war just as the South Koreans and their UN allies were about to neutralize the Northern forces. The nation didn't like capitalist countries assaulting independent communist nations, especially so close to their own territory. The war had now escalated, and despite all the capabilities of the UN task force, their available forces were somewhat limited. The US had massively contracted its military after World War II, and many of its brigades were nowhere close to Korea. The Commonwealth nations were also not prepared to support a lengthy war against a powerful country such as China. With only limited support from the West, the Chinese forces then advanced steadily over Korea and retook all the territories owned initially by the North. All South Korea and the UN coalition could do was to slow them down and hope for reinforcements or a ceasefire agreement. It was right then, just as Southern forces could barely hold the Chinese advance, that the Battle of Kapyong exploded, a confrontation that would completely change the outcome of the war. The battle. The UN commanders knew that two complete Chinese divisions were approaching their position. The 118th and the 60th Divisions had been relentlessly advancing towards them for some time, and the South Korean forces tasked to stop them had been crushed and forced to disband. On the evening of April 22, 1951, with only one day to prepare, the UN soldiers hastily dug into defensive positions, strategically spread out over the two hills overlooking the Kapyong Valley. The locations gave them a perfect defensive advantage, if only they had enough men to cover both hills thoroughly. As things stood, the defensive posts were vastly separated, making communication and interaction between them impossible. The Australians held one of the hills, and the Canadians protected the other one. while a small unit of American armored vehicles guarded the roads down in the valley. A 3rd New Zealander battalion was to arrive and provide artillery support, but it was still far from the battlefield. By 8 p.m. on April 23rd, many South Korean soldiers were retreating in panic through a gap in the line held by the UN brigade. The fleeing troops had suffered a devastating defeat, and although they would regroup behind the UN's front line, their numbers had been reduced by more than half. Just behind the panicking South Koreans, the Chinese 118th Division was in hot pursuit. Bolstered with over 10,000 men, the 118th engaged the Australian and Canadian forces. During their first attack, the Chinese managed to isolate some Australian troops, but through the soldiers' commitment and determination, they managed to survive until the Chinese were temporarily driven back. At night, the Chinese struck again by infiltrating themselves among the still retreating South Korean units, and the Australian forces had a difficult time distinguishing friend from foe in the sheer darkness. They were only able to hold the Chinese attack back thanks to the help of South Korean soldiers, who helped the Australians pick the North Koreans apart by the sound of their voices. The Chinese then coordinated several attacks from April 23rd to 25th, mainly striking the Australian position. The offensive was unending, yet the Australian forces put up a valiant defense, using their advantageous locations to shred through the incoming crowds of Chinese soldiers. Still, the Australian troops were exhausted and had endured close to 40 casualties by April 25th. Their commander then ordered them to retreat, and as they did, the only line of defense between the Chinese and the city of Kapyong was now the Canadian battalion. The Canadians hadn't been the focus of the attack until this point, and knowing no time to fight was coming, Captain J.G.W. Mills and his D Company decided to stand unyielding and hold the line until American reinforcements arrived. The attack was brutal and overwhelming, and the Canadians held their ground only thanks to the support of artillery fire provided by the New Zealand battalion that finally arrived. The men from D Company fought as hard as they could, but were eventually overrun by the Chinese forces at 1:10 p.m. And just when everything seemed lost for the Canadian troops, Mills requested the artillery units to fire directly on his position. He then ordered his men to duck and cover while a rain of fire fell upon them. The tactic was an outstanding success, neutralizing many attackers while not harming a single Canadian soldier. The Chinese offensive was immediately dissolved, and D Company lived to fight another day. A transcendental outcome. After the failed invasion, the Chinese battalions attempted additional advances, but they were much smaller in scale and equally unsuccessful. Ultimately, the UN forces only suffered 54 casualties, while the Chinese army lost over 1,000 men. The result of the battle had been absolutely conclusive, and it would be the last time that China attempted to penetrate the southern front line. Mao Zedong had been dissuaded from further pursuing the idea of conquering the Korean peninsula. The Battle of Kapyong also became a pivotal event in convincing Chinese and North Korean leaders that the best course of action was to seek a peace treaty, and in subsequent years, UN commanders met with their opposing counterparts to sign an armistice. Contained in that agreement were new borders for North and South Korea, the creation of a demilitarized zone between the two, and complete freedom for prisoners of war. The terms of the ceasefire deal are still valid to this day, and the existence of South Korea would be impossible without it and everything it entailed. The Korean War cost the lives of millions of Koreans and Chinese, as well as over 50,000 Americans, and also gave the world its first taste of the limited war scheme that would become an iconic banner of the period known as the Cold War. In regards to the Australian, Canadian, New Zealander, and American forces that sacrificed everything that week in the Battle of Kapyong, they were all received as heroes and were highly decorated with numerous medals and awards. The battle even originated a new military award with the same name as the valley where everything occurred, an honor given to the brave Canadian and Australian troops. Thank you for watching our video. What do you think was the most significant moment in the Korean War? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you don't want to miss more amazing historical anecdotes, please subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels, and don't forget to hit the notification bell.